Hurricane Michael made landfall on October 10th, just a little over 4 months ago, hitting the Florida Panhandle with a Category 4, 155 mile per hour winds, 14-foot storm surge. The third most intense hurricane to hit the United States ever. As far as the Panhandle, the first. I mean, major destruction. You can see the wind diagram there on the lower right, and the oyster growing areas all the way from the peninsula, Dixie County, all the way over to Escambia County were affected. Our Department of Agriculture did an initial assessment to see the impacts. So survey results are obviously catastrophic losses in those areas, shellfish aquaculture farms that were directly hit in Bay and Gulf counties. Areas affected by severe to moderate winds reported losses from 25 to 80%, heavy infrastructure, significant storm debris requiring cleaning up, significant resources used in storm prep. And that is amazing in itself, because this storm developed slowly in the Caribbean Sea, but as it progressed into the Gulf of Mexico and declared a tropical depression on October 7th, 3 days later is when it made landfall. An amazing amount of efforts by our new growers to prepare. We'll hear from them in a minute. And the other impact is we had our harvesting areas, our waters closed to harvest for quite a while afterward. The initial assessment loss to our growers, to the industry rather, is $5 million.
Thanks, Leslie. So as far as Florence was a big old bad storm. Very large. The thing that's kind of misleading about Florence is it was landed as a Cat 1 near Wilmington, but it was right. It was a strong Cat 2, weak Cat 3 right off the coast of North Carolina, and it lingered. It was going 2 miles an hour for like 24 hours, so it popped a lot of people. Once it got inland, it dropped a lot of rain, over 30-inch rains, and so this reflected in the type of damage differences we saw across the state. So we saw infrastructure and product damage, widespread damage with gear, hatcheries, nursery facilities, the product losses. Most of the losses we saw from the central northern coast of North Carolina was due to storm surge and wind damage. Against the south coast, mainly runoff. We had tremendously low salinity and dissolved oxygen, so it was kind of an effect where I had one grower post on social media right after the storm passed near Wilmington, holding up a SEPA basket and high-fiving his partner. About a week later, he's got a GoFundMe account on Facebook, so it was pretty rough. So we worked with NOAA we're still assessing this. We've updated this map and table. So right now we've got 57 operations that were affected. Some of those are small-scale relay operations and some clam farmers, but right now product and infrastructure loss it's about 10.6 million in North Carolina. So to move on here, we'd like to introduce our panelists, and then the next slide will be a series of questions. So I'm going to start, the list is up there, but we have 2 North Carolina farms represented and 3 Florida farms. So I'll hand the mic over, so if you don't mind introducing yourself.
My name is Tim Jordan. We've got a small farm, Saucy Lady Oysters, and a small packaging house. Do you want me to discuss what happened to us, or just pass it on down? Okay. We were able to sink we've got a combination Australian longline. And when we get to a certain size, we go to floating cages, and so we were able to sink our floating cages, but when we did, it was at the last minute, and some of them didn't land on their pontoons. Some were flipped from the storm, but we didn't lose any equipment, but we lost 69% of our oysters, and like you were saying, we lost a lot of them. Died after the event. We didn't realize how bad it was for another couple of weeks. I think Leslie told us that would happen, and true to form, that did. We did have insurance, but with the government shutting down, and we haven't heard a word from them, and it's not like private insurance where you can bug them because everything's in their control. So you don't want to be overbearing with them, but I'd sure like to find out where they're at. So we haven't, and some of us, if you didn't lose, I think 50%, you're not qualified for help. So that was another problem with a lot of our growers. So unfortunately, we lost 69%, but fortunately, we lost more than 50, I guess, if they pay out. We're not even sure of that yet, how they pay out. So anyway, with that in mind, we were, in our area, a lot of growers did lose their equipment. It was scattered all over the woods, and they're still finding baskets, and some methods held up a lot better than others, but it was a catastrophe.
I'm Jeff Tilley, and my company is Oyster Boss. We're a Florida farmer. We have six leases in Alligator Harbor. That totals out to be about 9 acres. And we were affected, obviously, with Hurricane Michael. So I'll give as brief a summary as possible. We actually came out very well because our farm managers decided to sink all of our equipment. We are in floating Ketchum and oyster grow cages. And the crews were able to get out on the water in time before the storm hit to take the caps off of the pontoons. And initially they were able to ride all of the floating cages to the bottom to make sure that they are actually sitting on the pontoons. But later, as the process unfolded, we had well in excess of 300 cages in the water. The weather worsened to the point to where the boys were just getting beaten up too much. We're in flat bottom boats. We work out of skiffs, 24-foot Carolina skiffs. So the decision was made to just go ahead and pull the caps off of the pontoons and hurry up and get it done. So there were a number of cages that wound up upside down, unfortunately, like Tim was just saying. And we did lose product. We lost about 3% of our product, though, not a significant amount. Unfortunately, a lot of the growers that are around us, our fellow growers, as I refer to them, chose for whatever reason not to sink their equipment, and they lost everything. We had a 16-foot storm surge in Alligator Harbor. So all of that gear, all of that equipment wound up in the woods on the north side of the highway. And I suspect deeply that what happened in that particular instance, there was so much debris that came off of Alligator Point, which lies due south. It lays due south of the farms, and got pushed north by the surge. I'm talking about docks and porches and boats with trailers still attached to them. All of that stuff came across the harbor, and I believe probably it snagged everybody's gear and basically pulled it out and took it with it into the woods. And of course, it was just an absolute mess and a total loss too. My son, who runs our farm, he takes care of everything on the water. He called me the day after. He had been able to make it down to the water's edge to check our gear. And while he had me on the phone, he described for me something happening just a few feet away from where he was. And it was a fellow grower, relatively small-time grower that we know quite well, who was absolutely sobbing. He had lost everything. And that story played out on more than just a couple of farms. So it was a big event for us. A best practices guide would be to, if it's possible, sink your gear, get it to the bottom. Hopefully you can get out there in time to make sure that it rests on the bottom appropriately. And beyond that, pray. Sometimes that's all we're left to do. I'm fond of saying that we really need Mother Nature to help us out in this industry, and she's a very fickle woman. So you don't often get her cooperation. So anyway, that's it for that.
My name is Ronald Sheffield. I own Topsail Sound Shellfish. Been farming for 10 years. Labor Day weekend, we were preparing, a plan of defense, staring down at a Category 4. I have a solar-powered upweller on the farm with 200,000 seed in it, and I had to, of course, sort those out a little bit, move them from the upweller bins out to floating cages. By now, the wind's picking up because I think the storm came in on the 14th. But removing the solar panel upweller to land, that was about a day's worth of work. There's a lot of preparation because you didn't know. Finally, the storm settled down to it looked like it's going to be a 1. Unfortunately, I'm a one-man army, so I've got about 75 oyster go cages out there, and you can imagine flipping those and pulling the caps off is very time-consuming, sinking them correctly. They don't lay down straight in a line like a train. They're going to cattail or fishtail. I didn't lose any equipment as far as the oyster grow cages. A few of them did flip over, and so the cages with the oysters in them were in the mud. And unfortunately, we had murky water for almost 3 weeks, so you never could see the cages. It was dangerous just traveling out there to the farms. The docks, piers, stairwells, 4x4 by 8 pylons, or just everything was floating, so it was very dangerous. You couldn't. It took me almost 3 weeks of work to get everything back upright. Went through a couple of motors on my winch because you're pulling something up that's 8 feet under, and then tide's working against you still. I do floating bags, flip bags as well. There I did have a pretty big hit. I found pure, 40-foot sections of rope with bags still attached 2 miles away, washed up on the shore of the Intercoastal Waterway, which was, 330 degrees flat north, straight over islands and trees, and so what else? Well, I probably lost 50 to 75 bags with oysters in them. So it's not a complete loss, but it was very difficult to work through. The planning and preparation is extremely important. So if you see something that bad coming at you, it's hard to tell, but just hope for the best and expect the worst. But the equipment and the time is all something you just got to plan on. Something bad's going to happen one day. It just can't predict the future, but you can expect it.
I'm Ryan Belter. We started an oyster farm, my father and I, we're still a pretty young farm. This is probably our 5th year having product in the water, and our 4th year, we're going into our 4th year of making sales. We were really fortunate this year. There was a lot of storms, and I know the Gulf seemed like it got more storms than usual, at least than I'm used to seeing on the Weather Channel and on the internet. And we were really nervous about this past storm that caused so many on the mainland side of North Carolina to have all the losses. We were very fortunate just because of where the storm came in on the coast. If it had made landfall about 100 miles north, it would have been disastrous, and for us probably, and a lot of the farms that had damage would have done a lot better because they wouldn't have had that storm surge. And so like the differences in geographical location, even though it doesn't seem like a large difference, it can be huge. And every storm is different, and sometimes, the category of the storm may not have as much to do with it as how fast it's moving and where your wind directions are coming from, and what your local what your local terrain and your geography is like. So, but we did get hit quite hard a couple years ago with Matthew, and that was one where everyone else did fine, and we got slammed, along with a couple of our neighbors who are on the coast, on the Outer Banks. One thing are we going to talk about things that we would do?
We'll do that in a minute.
Okay. Yeah, you don't want to lose gear. If you're a part-timer, it's just gonna, and you don't really need it. You've got another job that's more full-time. You can probably weather it, and it's just gonna set you back a lot of time. if it's your main thing and you're going for it, you might have a catastrophic loss that might end your oyster career. You may have to go do something else, depending on what your circumstances are. And so the loss of gear is a factor. The loss of the product is a factor. The time that you put into it, even if you're able to go find your gear, maybe you're getting your gear back, but your product is dead, most likely. And you're sinking time into looking for stuff. It's just really bad for morale all around, and you want to avoid losses as much as you can, and so it's definitely worth a lot of thought.
Hey y'all, I'm Kanan Gregg, Pelican Oyster Company in Panacea. I lost about 70% of my oysters, the majority of those being market-ready oysters. And a few weeks before the storm, I had just planted 300,000 seed, and I lost the majority of those also. I had a long conversation with Bill Walton on my drive back from Pensacola before the storm. Should I sink them or should I leave them? And I decided to leave them. And I believed that I had built my farm strong enough. And I was right. It was there, but it didn't take the oysters didn't take the thrashing of the storm, the change. The water temperature changed almost 20 degrees overnight, and then the turbidity of the water, and just all. I mean, who knows which of those, or if not a little of all of them, killed those oysters. But my neighbor, one lease to the north, he did sink all his bags, and where we're at, unlike Alligator Harbor, where Jeff Tilley's farm is all mud and silt. So that farmer that did sink all his, they were all buried, and they were down there, with brooms, trying to stir up the dirt, just trying to get them loosened up. So it's kind of a damned if you do, damned if you don't. But I did get to test the strength of that system, and majority of it held tight. If I could update the numbers that you read earlier, there was a more recent survey done in Florida, and 80% of the farms reported losses. Only 40% of the farms actually got to take the survey, and the new number is at 12 million. And if everybody did get to weigh in, it could possibly be 24 to 30 million in losses, which is about 90,000 an acre. And just to put that in perspective, the timber industry in Florida, which had it's a catastrophic event, they're reporting about $600 an acre. So the loss in aquaculture has been pretty massive. And so with my recent unemployment, I've been super vocal. I live in the Capitol. My child's daycare is right next to the Capitol building. So I'm on the steps, and I'm calling everybody, and I'm asking them how they're going to help this emerging industry stay on its feet, and how we're going to secure Florida's future as far as aquaculture goes, and what are they going to do to help us keep it going, and because this is definitely an early blow to an industry where there's not a lot of affluent people in the first place. But I was using Zapco floating bags, and then I just had those anchored in on both sides with helical anchors.
All right, the other questions I think we need to go back and address. What about your immediate and longer term recovery strategies other than hanging around the Capitol? And what would you do different the next storm?
Yeah, for me, I thought I had a bunch of creative ways of maximizing the amount of oysters I could put on my lease and stuff like that. And now I'm just simplifying things, and and I think I know how to build, a strong infrastructure, but I'm just simplifying it and keeping everything simple. I'm not messing with, I don't know. I just can't say it easier than just I'm trying to keep it simple. I had a lot of crazy stuff that I was trying to do, and I had a couple of repairs that I didn't make that I should have made, and so for me, everything has got to be ready, before the storm, and if not ready when you build it, to take the storm.
Yeah, that's a really good point. We had that sounds very familiar. Like, we had some things that, you may have so much labor for your farm, and you got a lot of things that you'd like to have done, and you're sort of prioritizing. And some weaknesses in your gear. This is definitely gonna show, and that's what happened when we had most of our losses. We are in floating gear. We're just using single floating bags. So, and we have anchor points, and we have lines in rows, and it's attached, in rows. So we have several hurricane scares a year, though, and we're sort of in that when you're looking to sink your whole lease every time, you don't necessarily know where these storms are going to go, and it gets down to where it starts to look like, it's definitely going to hit. You really don't have a lot of time. So you're having to make a decision about, do I sink them? Do I not sink them? I'm not sure what the best solution is yet. I know that stronger is better. The commercial fishermen, ocean fishermen told us, whatever you think you need, double it, triple it on line. And he was absolutely right. And I had ideas about what would be strong enough. And, stronger is better. I mean, when you're thinking about if you're thinking about saving money on any type of, that stuff is way cheaper than losing your gear, for sure. So, but as far as sinking or just trying to bulk it up floating, we're kind of playing around. I may get a little of both and have some sinking gear and try to figure out what works for our location. Every location is really, really different, and people say that, and it is very true. So, and for more than your water quality and your weather conditions, so depth, and then we're on sand, but some people have muddy bottoms. So,
as far as future preparation, the North Carolina Shellfish Growers Association, which I'm a member of, we did have an active group of helpers, which I didn't call on, which I should have, but we were all up and down the coast. Nobody knew where it was going to be hit the worst. So I would suppose I probably wouldn't delay as long sinking the cages. And I've probably prepared myself with apparatuses to help me get the equipment up faster, because you couldn't see it. You were looking in water that was like coffee for 3 weeks. In the future, I believe, I lost a lot of bottom cages. I'll go 3 methods: 4-tier bottom cages, floating bags, and the Oyster Grow. And the 4-tier bottom cages, if they were secured, they wouldn't have been moved a mile. I don't know where they are now. Some of them just in a channel I can't even get my boat to pull out. I saw it about 2 weeks ago, and I snatched on that thing for an hour, and it's just tilted down in the sand. It won't budge. I do have a boat with a pump on it, and I can jet it out. It's the only thing I know is to jet that thing up, but it's got oysters in it, and it's down there. But there's a lot of that equipment with oysters in it that went away. I don't know where it is. One thing I thought about doing was getting a drone, but the only friend I knew that had one, he works for the wildlife department, and they were looking in swamps and stuff like that for people and houses and stuff like that. So, aerial assistance would be helpful in the event for marking it. The North Carolina Shellfish Growers Association is pretty much putting together a plan to where we will mark all our equipment with tags, like the caliber pin, so every piece of equipment has a number on it, and it can be registered, and maybe get it out to the public that if you see this equipment, don't throw it away. It does have some financial value to somebody. It just didn't appear out of the sky. And so that's something that we're going to do in the future, to at least try to tag our bags.
So, in summary, what I'd like to just mention is all of us should carefully consider the architecture of the grow-out equipment that we're using. Some of that equipment is going to survive better under these adverse conditions than others. So I would advise that. I would also advise, and I'm sure we're already doing this, to take the weather forecasts very, very seriously. Monitor them closely. Hopefully we're going to get good information. I did have a critique of the forecasts there toward the tail end of the Hurricane Michael saga when the storm was approaching the coast. I'm not sure anybody really realized the power that it would have, the monster that it became. So we'll just all try to do our best there. The last thing I want to say, Leslie and I are talking about right now the issues in terms of encouraging the industry to make sure all of our equipment is tagged so that we can identify it in the aftermath of it breaking away and floating off somewhere, and hopefully get it returned to the right owner. I do know that the shores of Alligator Harbor, where we farm, were littered literally with equipment that no one could identify because no one tags their equipment. So my encouragement would be to do that.
We've got a little brand that we use to stamp our name on our equipment, and fortunately we didn't lose equipment, so we're not going to change what we did there. But there was one thing I want to mention, another impact of the storm that, as bad as on the farming end of it, was the marketing end. My partner and I got the bright idea to go out and bring in all we could. We got one of these little trailers with a cooler on it, and we filled it full of oysters. And after the storm, there wasn't a place around that was open, so we had to put them all back out there. But those didn't die. Those are the only ones that didn't die, I guess. But the impact on the market's still there. There's still a lot of restaurants and from here to Wakulla County that aren't open, and one of the biggest ones that sold oysters, y'all probably know the Indian Pass store. They sell 3,000, 4,000 a week, and they're shut down. So that's a huge impact on our market. That in addition to losing the oysters, we did that. And I want to say one other thing. Our little community, we're from Panacea, Florida. They just had a festival for us, which was fantastic, and they let us go sell our oysters, and we got all the proceeds. We got $1 an oyster. I think we shucked 23,000 oysters in about 6 hours. So it was a huge success, and we really appreciate the support we got from our community. You know, that was a big thing.
Cool. All right, so what kind of disaster assistance programs are out there? Every oyster grower is eligible for the USDA Farm Service Agency's Non-Insured Disaster Assistance Program, or NAP. If you're not signed up for that, go look on the FSA website, find out where your county office is, and knock on their door. Unfortunately, you just can't sign up any time of the year. You have a deadline to sign up. In Florida, I think it's by August 31st. It's not a big payout, but it does provide some assistance. I was so pleased to read in a couple issues ago of Fish Farming News that Kurt Himmel, as a result of the impacts from Hurricane Irma or Matthew, Irma, whatever, that he received a payment for his hatchery seed. I thought that was very, very good to hear. Also, any federal relief that will come down, congressional appropriations generally are funneled through FSA. So to qualify, you have to have had been eligible or enrolled in NAP. Or if not, to get that additional indemnity payment, then you have to agree to pay for NAP, and it's a buy-up. And if it's a buy-up in that year, you have to pay that high premium cost for maybe 1, 2, 3 years. Sometimes that negates your indemnity payment. So,
Yeah, the the NAP program is there. If you don't sign up for it, it's a limited investment for it, but it's a limited payback for it. So it's not really a solution for consistent disasters. So we're fortunate in North Carolina that the Department of Agriculture stepped in at the last minute and allowed shellfish aquaculture to be covered. The General Assembly appropriated the Department of Ag $240 million to assist agriculture producers. Of that, about $10 million is going to be directed towards shellfish producers. So we've got the bulk of the industry signed up for that. We're also working on a development or looking into develop an insurance program, not just for North Carolina, but potentially the East Coast and perhaps the Gulf Coast. We're using some of that money appropriated by the legislature to hire a professional insurance consulting firm, and they're developing a concept paper, or they soon will, and so we'll keep folks updated on that. With that, I know do we have time for a couple of questions, quick ones, or okay? Any input from the audience or question? Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, that's a good point. You brought up the fact is know your neighbor, and we preach that in North Carolina. Get to know your neighbor, your fellow producers, that you can band together, for help if needed. Yeah, go ahead and back.
The question was why Alligator Harbor wasn't impacted as bad as Oyster Bay and Skipper Bay, some of the other. And Alligator Harbor is a closed system and doesn't have tributaries that feed fresh water into the farms, and that they survive really well. And they don't stay closed as long either, because it's a great place to have a lease, But their salinity is very high, and they just didn't have that impact from the freshwater.
Well, also, it's a harbor. The fetch isn't very big. Oyster Bay is open waters almost.
Yeah, that's true.
He's asking, for folks that had oyster grows, did you put your caps back on?
Some.
You want to answer this one too?
They recommend it, and I think we did some and some we didn't, and they just had a lot of mud in them. You just had to flush them out. I think that was the difference.
Our experience with that was we tried to get the caps back on. Our guys tried to get the caps back on after the cages were floated to the bottom and guided to the bottom. As the day wore on and the weather got worse, I mentioned that we